Okay. Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome for this adult ed session. It's one of really 3 sessions on the Lutheran Church and racism. This session came about in conversation with Hal and Kevin and Toya. During the dark days of the pandemic, beginning days, I was doom scrolling in our apartment in Evanston, and I was reading various articles, and one was the 100 best documentaries in the United States. And I was scrolling through the list, and I come across, number 54 or something. And it lists the description for A Time for Burning, saying this is a ELCA or a Lutheran congregation that went through this cinema verite style, and I thought, I'd never heard of this. So of course I stayed up for the next 2 hours at midnight, watching one of the most riveting documentaries I'd ever seen about racism in the Lutheran Church. And so now fast forward to the meet and greet when I met so many of you out on the lawn before I took the call, and who walks up to me but Hal and Pam. Hal had recognized my name, I think, and put 2 and 2 together and said, I came to the South Bronx right after your parents were there and I was a little baby to shoot documentary film footage, right? I called my father right after that. I said, Dad, you're not going to believe this, but one of the members has this connection to the South Bronx where we had our ministry. And so then in conversation, as we got to know each other, I realized the deep connection that Hal and his family have, not only with documentary filmmaking, obviously, and all kinds of amazing media, but the connection that Hal had to this film personally. And it blew my mind. And so I approached Hal. We started talking with Toya and Kevin about how could we use this as a vehicle, especially during Black History Month, to engage with these difficult topics of racism in the church. So that's why we're here, is because we're trying this out. So thanks for coming. I am going to hand this microphone over to Kevin, and please welcome Hal and Kevin for this first session.
So this one, thank you. Hal's going to mostly run this one. We realized we're going to kind of do, since we have 2 weeks, we wanted to do different things in them. So we came on this idea of formation and transformation. So this is kind of how our racial lens is formed, what are the things that feed that, and then on March 6th we'll talk about how do we transform that. Take it away, Pops.
Well, thank you. When I was first invited to do this, I thought, well, I am not an expert on race relations. I have no degrees, no actual experience in those matters. Is that loud enough or high enough? Okay. Can you hear okay? Okay. Usually I'm told to tone it down. So, but what I realized while I was thinking about it is that, and because my family has been asking me to write my story, I've been journaling and writing this, and it keeps growing as more memories return to me. And so I realized that through my life and daily work, I was blessed to connect with proximity with all kinds of people that don't look like me. And I ran into somebody who talked about brain patterning, brain mapping. And the idea, of course, is as you develop even from the womb and on, all input, all sensory input gets mapped in and organized, and it's unconscious, beyond your knowing. It just happens to you. And we kind of know that now. And so I was curious about how my brain got mapped around race. And so I started working on that journal. And what I realized is that we have no control over it. So if you are born or raised into a certain setting and all the input is in a particular direction, that patterning is not your fault. But you do have the opportunity to re-examine that at some point in your life. So I often think about it as a kind of an operating system, so that the OS in a Mac is invisible to those of us who use it, and also incomprehensible too, of course. And the way it is coded is the way it functions. So much of our response to the world is automatic, emotional, and unconscious. So some of those reactions often come in the form of feeling threat, anxiety, fear, trust, comfort, all those responses or reactivity is kind of automatic. And that mapping, I've learned, kind of creates an unconscious narrative. It's not something you're probably aware of. And if later, particularly as you mature, you don't examine that mapping and that narrative, you have what I call the hardening of the categories. And so I thought I would kind of give you, these are very brief little glimpses into my life from an early age to give you a hint of the mapping of my life. So I was raised in a very small town in Northern California. We had a lot of Mexican people, and I had a few friends, but we had one black person. He was called the Boot Black, and he shined shoes at the Rich Lou Bar. And I learned later, of course, that boot black is a derogatory term. In Sunday school, I remember singing the song, "Jesus Loves the Little Children of the World," all the children, red and yellow, black and white. Now we don't use those terms, but I also remembered at an early age attending a minstrel show where these men dressed up in blackface made fun of black people. And I also overheard my dad's friends talking about why are there so many black people, they use colored people on the San Francisco Giants team. Willie Mays is okay, maybe Willie McCovey, but why are they continuing to add black people to the roster? I also listened to Amos and Andy on the radio. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember that, where white guys made like they knew how black people talk. And it was a caricature of black people mostly. And then I remember one day, and I actually told this story a couple of years ago here, I was working at my dad's service station, and well, we called him a wino, now it would be unhoused, chemically dependent person, he lived under the Stony Creek Bridge, and he wandered in, he stank like heck, and matted hair, really disheveled, had probably been drinking. He said, "I hate those N's," using what you can imagine the word is, and he said, "They are worse than pigs, no disrespect for pigs." And I thought at the time that he smells like he lived in a sty. That irony was lost on him. It wasn't lost on me. Then I remember watching the integration battles, Little Rock and other places. And I have one scene in my mind of adults screaming at this beautiful little black girl with somebody ushering her into the school there. That image really is strong. And then my cousin Faye married a black man. And nobody talked out loud, but there was buzz of disappointment and disapproval. And then when I was in high school, the first Constituting Convention of the Luther League was to take place in Miami. And Martin Luther King was invited to speak, which was an amazing thing. However, the head of the youth department got 600 letters and asking him to withdraw the invitation. And King said he would withdraw. However, the leadership, including the bishop, or then the president of the church, insisted that we go ahead, and he spoke. And that youth department was under question for a long time thereafter. And he invited the youth in the face of oppression to be proudly maladjusted. Does that sound familiar? Making good trouble, right? And it was the first time many people have heard a black man, a preacher, preach. Then in college, I worked my way in radio, and I read the news on the hour and half hour, and I was reading about this Martin Luther King guy, and he was stirring up trouble. And I wondered if he was a troublemaker or what that was all about. I wasn't sure about him. And then I moved to Southern California for college and continued to read the news. And in 1965, if you remember or old enough, that was the Watts riots. And it was horrible. Millions of dollars of damage and people killed, and it raged for a long time. And I was reading that headline all the time. And 400 arrests, 34,000 people were involved, the destruction of 1,000 buildings, and lots of damage. And my cousin, who was more like my brother, was in the National Guard in LA. Interesting conversations we had. I'll leave it there. So then I came to seminary, and if you know anything about the late 60s, early 70s, Vietnam War raging, cities burning, this is the height of it all. And I continued to work in a local radio station and read about the riots now on the north side of Minneapolis, right? And did that while I'm studying theology while the records run. So I was reading the scripture and reading the culture at the same time. And then the next year I went to work for the television, radio, films department of the American Lutheran Church and helped produce a rock and roll radio show syndicated nationally called Silhouette. And I happened to be able to interview lots and lots of people. And I'll tell you about some of those people in a minute, but then, because I was in this building, they showed me the film A Time for Burning. I was blown away. Suddenly, so much of what I was trying to make sense of came home. And the connection to the film grew because Ray Christensen, who is in that film, probably one of the protagonists who really had turned during the making of that film, moved to Minneapolis and became a filmmaker because he was so taken by the power of film, and especially cinema verite. He became a dear friend, a mentor, loaned me his very expensive camera, gave me 2 rolls of film, paid for the processing and mentored me into filmmaking. Then I met the executive producer, Bob Lee. The irony is, his real name is Robert E. Lee. And I got to know him because he was the head of Lutheran Film Associates. And because Lutheran Film Associates was a little offshore from the regular church, he could gather funds for that film and make it happen. Let's just say he caught a little hell having done that. And I watched this process of dealing with this tough subject. So in the process then, I learned about cinema verite, which if you've seen the film, you gotta get a sense of it. It's not a mediated form. You get to be in the room. Clearly somebody edited it, so it wasn't totally unmediated, but largely you get to be a part of it without having it filtered or mediated by a host or a narrator. And I found it so powerful that it was so, proximity was the word, right? You got to be there, and those people are real people. And so that form or style of filmmaking had an enormous impact. And I have tried to use that form in everything I've done since, including radio. And so that first-person narrative style was really big. But what I remember is when Ernie Chambers was interviewed for that film, he sounded a lot like the people I met in North Minneapolis when things were burning, because the seminary during those times closed the campus, and we went on an adventure listening to the folks who were impacted by racism. So we spent a whole week in the north side of Minneapolis. Ernie's speech sounds very familiar. So I think we could play a clip of that now.
The few particulars that make Omaha different from New York are just incidental. The problem exists because white people think they're better than black people, people think they're better than others. I can't solve the problem. You guys pull the strings that close schools. You guys are the boundaries that keep our kids restricted to the ghetto. You guys are the restricted covenants that keep us out of houses. So it's up to you to talk to your brothers and your sisters and persuade them that they have a responsibility. We've assumed ours for over 400 years, and we're tired of this kind of stuff now. We're not going to suffer patiently anymore. No more turning the other cheek, no more blessing our enemies, no more praying for those who spitefully use us. We're going to show you that we've learned the lessons you taught us, we've studied your history, and you did not take over this country by saying we shall overcome. You did not gain control of the world like you have it now by dealing fairly with the man and keeping your word. You're treaty breakers, you're liars, you're thieves, you rape entire continents and races of people. Then you wonder why these very people don't have any confidence or trust in you. Your religion means nothing. Your law is a farce, and we see it every day. You demonstrated it in Alabama. And I can say you, because you're part of the whole system, you robbed it from it. In fact, you make your living from it. You could walk around and talk to people, stand up in your pulpit on Sunday and preach nice little songs and say, now we're going to give thanks to the Lord for he is good and old Jesus be among us. As far as we're concerned, your Jesus is contaminated, just like everything else you tried to force upon us is contaminated. So you can have him. And here's what I'll say, I wish you would follow Jesus like we follow him. Because if you did that, then we'd be in charge tomorrow. I think the problem is so bad that we can have no understanding at all.
I just have the point where there can never be that reconciliation.
No. You talk about justice, it means one thing to you. We talk about it means something else to us. And it'll always be that way. And I'd like you to know I have a terrible feeling against preachers because I think you guys are the ones who are largely responsible for the problem in the first place. And you can accept it, but not any way you choose. And for you, this may be an excursion, in across the line.
A person that wants to listen, I genuinely feel that I want to listen.
Well, if you listen and try to do something, you get kicked out of your church. See, that's where your people are. Well, this is where we change the God bless you, brother. Come back and see us again sometime. And don't look back in anger. Thanks for taking so well. He thought we were going to go here like they do us. If we went to one of their places, everybody would jump out of their chairs and got some ropes together and hung one of us. We didn't even go to one of the places like this.
Yes.
Well, here's where we are. We've confessed our sins. We've tried to open up and say, doggone it, we did this. We did do it. We're all guilty, terribly guilty. But what do we do now? Do we sit around in despair? If we do, then let's all knock ourselves off and get the heck off the earth. Or do we try to live together and work out a better life?
Hard stuff to hear. And I've heard hard stuff. And if you can hang in there and listen, it transforms you. And one of the things I learned from Ernie and this film and all the connections I've had with people is the difference between trait and state or condition. And that's a really important framing of the way you look at other people, because if you look at them as their trait, then you say they're undereducated, at risk, impoverished, fatherless, whatever. That becomes a trait as a definition of them, rather than one of the challenges they face. And if you make that shift, it gives you a chance to do what Travian Shorters calls asset framing. So then you can see these people as friends, capable human beings, lovable, given a chance, can make a difference in the world. And that's been my experience. And I remember interviewing Tony Bozza. Do you remember him as the irascible police chief in Minneapolis? Fun guy. And, oh, there you go. And I remember he was former transit police in New York City. And he said, if you go to New York City and spend some time in the tenements in the ghetto, you see nothing but gray, litter, noise, hopelessness, and what's playing in your brain is a dirge, funeral dirge of the end of the world. He said, however, look carefully. You'll see a mother holding the hand of a little girl heading to school against all odds, and you hear a triumphant symphony in your head. That's asset framing. And now, switching story, if you know John Elvisaker, wrote Born and Cry, toured nationally, he and I and a bunch of other guys created a band, and we were so concerned about the way the country was handling racial and Vietnam War issues and all. We toured nationally with a multimedia kind of concert around the perils of wilderness wandering, kind of referencing what happens to people when they live in the middle and don't know the outcome, right? Which is what's happening now, of course. So we saw the Israelites wanting to go back to the good old days when make Egypt great again kind of thing. And people deciding that their God didn't work very well, they'll make a new one. And then there were some faithful ones who said, no, I'm going to hang in there. We're going to see the promised land. So while we were doing that, we were in some pretty scary places. And one of them, by the way, this is the irony of all, we were at Augustana Lutheran Church in Omaha in the early 70s. People walked out, by the way. I took, when I was in seminary, one of my friends was Isaac, we called him Ike Harraday. He was 9 years in the Air Force and was suffering from bipolar illness, and in spite of all, became the first black pastor in the newly formed American Lutheran Church. He was an amazing friend. We had some really good conversations. Then one of my clinical pastoral education assignments was Stillwater Prison. And there I heard the stories of particularly black men who could not overcome the challenges of injustice, of poverty, of abuse, of chemical dependency. You can name them. And it became really clear why they were there. Then I got into more movie making, and we headed off to the Bronx and shot at St. Peter's in the Bronx. I was blown away by that church. The service was so lively. It looks like Tony Bozza describes. This is not suburbs, right? This is a poorer neighborhood. And inside, those people were jubilant and joyous in their worship, and it was so infectious. We were to tour the neighborhood, and the pastor assigned some teenagers with their bicycles to haul all of our gear around. They gave us a really good inside tour of that neighborhood. Then I did a lot of reading in those days, like the autobiography of Malcolm X and Letters from a Birmingham Jail and Black Like Me and a few others. And then if you remember Norman Lear, he was kind of the great hope for television. But before that, the Roots series, Kunta Kinte, and that was transformative for me. And also then All in the Family and Sanford and Sons, The Jeffersons, Good Times, even The Cosby Show, although Bill's name has been besmirched since. In the meantime, Kristen was bringing her friends home, the two Sarahs, one black and one Korean. And I met these wonderful people working in the church. One of them, Vivian Jenkins Nelson, who started Interrace at Augsburg College. She created these salons which gave people a chance to talk, to share their humanity with one another. I could tell you more about her, but we don't have time. Sandra Holloway, who was another colleague, wonderful black woman who made her specialty to raise up black women in leadership positions. And if you know Angela Kebeb, locally, she was one of her mentees. And one of the things I remember best about Sandra is she introduced me to sweet potato pie. If you haven't tried it, you gotta have some. Then Magali Rodriguez was in Liberty City when Miami blew up. I don't know if you have any memory of that in 1980. Terrible riots down there. And she and a band of, I guess, volunteers, I don't know if they were hired or what, they formed street musicians. They worked overtime to calm the people and then help organize for change. Magali then came to the ALC involved in multicultural ministry, and the one thing she taught me was around multiculturalism is own your own roots, take them deep, appreciate them, and then be radically open to all others. And that means you're not operating out of a position, I'm going to appropriate your culture, I'm going to change who I am in order to relate to you. You can relate across those divides. So, how are we doing? I don't want to take too much time. And I continued to interview lots and lots of people, including Andrew Young, if you remember him, pastor and head of Southern Leadership Conference. Powerful interview. Then we produced a 4-part television series called We're Number One, looking at America's propensity for domination and race being among them. There we interviewed Jesse Jackson, went to Operation Breadbasket in Chicago, where they, up with hope, down with dope, I hear him say. And he would bring kids up on stage and they would applaud them on their good grades. They also helped organize to support black businesses and to organize for economic development. We spent some time in his home, and one of the other thing I remember him talking about is we need to do civil rights for sure, but we need to do silver rights as well, economic equity as well. A part of that film was Esther Roll, Mama on Good Times, if you watched that series. She read for us The Negro Mother by Langston Hughes. If you ever get a chance, read that. That gives you a sense of that previous generation of black women who persevered through Jim Crow and very difficult circumstances. And I read that to Toya at one point because she reminds me of the Negro Mother. I also interviewed Eldridge Cleaver. That's an interesting story if you know anything about the Black Panther movement. Very violent, kind of overthrow of the government. He was in jail for a time, wrote Soul on Ice, had converted to Christianity and then waffled from there. It's an imperfect story, but interesting view of racial relations. We also interviewed or spent time with Kane Hope Felder, who is a black theologian out of Howard University, wrote Stony the Road We Trod, really helped people read scripture through an African lens to help us see that there's a lot of Africans who show up in scripture that we pass right over. Powerful theologian. Also, I interviewed and for my radio program, Albert Sample. And I think, Daniel, you listened to that show on Scan. And this is a guy who was born of a black prostitute in Texas and a cotton broker, a white cotton broker. And he was abused and ran away from home, spent 17 years in prison, was given the name of Racehorse because of the way he could chop cotton in one of those prison farms. Had an amazing kind of experience in solitary where he met God. And In the end, long story, but he was eventually released, pardoned, ended up working for the governor in restorative justice in the governor's office, the state of Texas. Oh, there are more, I'm sorry. Are you getting tired? The other person that I spent quite a bit of time with, Sharon Sales Belton, who later became mayor. The story we were telling was of her, at that point being a single mom, she later married. She had a profoundly disabled daughter, and she was fighting for the dignity of people with these deep disabilities. And brave woman, and I came to know and love her. We also then produced a documentary with Otis Woodard, interesting guy. He was standing next to Martin Luther King when King was shot. He was a member of the CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. He said he was a little lieutenant. He was on the sidelines, but he was under death threat immediately. He and his wife and one small child, his wife was pregnant, they told him, get out of here, get out of Memphis or you'll be next. He used all of his money, landed in St. Louis, penniless, had no money, no food, nothing. And there's a long story there, but he eventually got connected to Concordia Seminary, begged a student for food. They brought him food. He said, if you feed me, God, I will feed people who need food. And he did. He started Lutheran outreach in North St. Louis, probably the most dangerous neighborhood in the world. And he recently died of cancer. But in the middle of handing out food, clothing, all kinds of things to people in need, the gang members were not happy with him. They burned his house down, including all the supplies. Instead of rebuilding, he built the lot into a place called the Peace Park. And in the meantime, Walter Brueggemann, if you know anything about Walter, is an Old Testament scholar. We brought him down because we were so moved by what was happening there. And Walter did on the lot where the dead bodies were be thrown from gang wars in the morning, did a piece on Jeremiah and the city. And then we also had Otis lead us on a tour of St. Louis, North St. Louis. And we did a video called Reading Scripture in North St. Louis. And, you know, again, you can hear the mapping going on in my head. Then I met Mary Henry, who is in South Central LA. She is in the middle of Watts. She helped rebuild Watts after the riots. She helped to create the Martin Luther King Drew Medical Center there, and was on President Johnson's task force to create Head Start. She was on the ALC Church Council nationally. A force of nature, and tough as nails. And I have a lot of pictures of her in my head, but the one that I'm so fond of is we were trying to get ready to interview her, and she was just like a butterfly, flitting all over, making stuff happen. A teenager came in the door, and she ran over to him immediately and pushed him up against the wall and read him the Riot Act. We couldn't hear, but we could guess. And he had his head down the whole time, and we don't know what was going on. Finally, she stopped. He had his head down. She raised his chin up, said, "Give me a hug." They embraced. Long, long embrace. That's the image. Then we also, there are a lot of them, that we also documented the street ministry in Berkeley, California. Even though it's a fairly wealthy community, a lot of homeless folks. They're all over. And this wonderful woman was named chaplain, street chaplain. She recruited 12 street people and trained them and to do street ministry. One of them was this wonderful tall black guy who was schizophrenic. And as long as he's on meds, he was fine. But he knew about schizophrenia. So when some homeless person would be escalating in the neighborhood, the police would call him, and he would know how to do it. They said he had the magic touch, and he did. Then I met Melvin Carter Sr., who was a juvenile police officer at the time. He started Save Our Sons because he saw the devastation of what happens when these kids aren't supported and loved. And so we followed him around, including Melvin Carter Jr., as he was grabbing these kids under his arm and mentoring them on the way. And in the meantime, we met Thelma Buckner. Anybody heard of Thelma Buckner? Another force of nature. Well, Thelma Buckner lived in the Rondo neighborhood. She had a single mom, mother of 10 kids, 3 sets of twins. And what she knew how to do is sing and play the piano. And she taught her kids how to sing, and they formed the Gospel Twins and toured the world. That's how they made some money. Several of them now sing in the the Sounds of Blackness, by the way. Well, she had over 1,000 kids through her house. She had bought a big old, not a mansion, it was a big house in Rondo neighborhood. And as her kids left, she could bring in more kids. And Melvin Carter said when he picked up a kid, hey, I can take you either to juvenile hall or I could take you to Ms. Buckner. What do you think? And they'd have to think about it because they knew Miss Buckner was sort of like Mary Henry. There'd be hell to pay, but there'd be love. And I remember her saying, when they walk in the door, she'd say, pull up them pants and give Mama a hug. And she did. And she loved a lot of kids into a productive life. And toward the end, when she couldn't get around very well, she had a sewing circle of Black and Asian and Native kids, teaching them to sew and made quilts. What a picture. We also documented the story of St. Dismas, which is a Lutheran church inside the prison at Patuxent in Maryland. And one image that sticks out of my mind, we interviewed this Black guy who had had a horrible life. And we didn't even ask why he was in prison, didn't matter. But we saw him later in worship with singing, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom, and tears running down his cheek. And enough said. And then another documentary, we went to Cleveland, and that social service agency had a program of reparative and restorative justice where ex-offenders would be recruited, trained, and put into service, in this case in a high school, very dangerous high school in Cleveland. Gang wars were raging, and these guys, wearing their red berets, would break up fights, would mentor these kids, and of course they had street cred, you can imagine. Tell them, you could have been where I've been, you know? And then one of the women who was participating was assigned to a senior high-rise, and the women just fell in love with her, and her favorite client died and left everything to her. It wasn't a lot, but she said, that was the mama I never had. Then another trip to Cleveland, sorry I keep going on. It was a very depressing, snowy, miserable day. And we got to the church in a very, very poor part of Cleveland. We set up to record the video, the service, and I was very depressed. I wanted to be anywhere but there. And then I set up the camera in the front, and the next thing I know, somebody's ripping on the piano, and the choir is dancing down the aisle, singing, "We've come this far by faith, leaning on the Lord, trusting in his holy word. He's never failed us yet. Oh, can't turn around." I was in tears through the whole service. Well, I don't know. I think I can probably quit. There's more. But what I felt like as I started thinking about this, because I haven't thought about it actually, but it made it so easy to accept and love my new family. And I can't tell you what a blessing these experiences have been, and what a blessing my family, Kevin's new family, Toya, Micah, Reuben, and Sapphira are to me. And God had a way. There she is. I told my family, I want to be old, and Gabriel back there, and he's running the video, by the way. Speaking of assets, Sapphira, I want to live long enough to be at Sapphira's inauguration in Washington, D.C. So, Kev, pick it up here.
Hi. So I won't try to make this too long, but I think it was after Philando was murdered, I found myself wondering why I was kind of ahead of the curve of folks, aside from the fact of who I'm married to. And because I was working with fellow producers, I'm a producer at TPT, and we were talking about, how do we talk about racism? And they're brilliant people, and they're all in great spots, and I'm not all of them are white men, but at the time a lot of us were. And I couldn't kind of figure out why my thinking and my views felt further ahead than folks. And you need to know that I am, this is all going to sound like humble bragging, and it's not. I have confidence issues. I'm not a confident person. I don't believe strongly in myself. And so the concept that I would be remarkable was terrifying, because I'm not remarkable, and I don't really want to be remarkable, because I've never have been. And so I started to kind of take stock of there's a similar line here, but kind of from where he came from, kind of rural white, very kind of closed thinking, to how am I where I am today. And I thought, again, it can't be remarkable. And then I started to think, what were all the things that formed who I am around issues of race? And I'll cruise through these quickly. A lot of them were church-related, which was really wonderful, and a lot of them were really deeply intentional on behalf of other people besides myself, and some were just kind of the conditions that I found myself in. So among them, school integration, which happened long before I came along, meant that my classes, even in kindergarten, were incredibly diverse, way more diverse than when I went to college, right? It was, looking back at photos of classrooms, incredibly diverse in 1980, whatever it was. And you don't think about it, it's just what it was. But watching this film, you kind of go back to, oh my gosh, I can't imagine being in an all-white classroom forever and just never having those experiences. Our neighborhood in Park is and was extremely white. There happened to be one family of color, I think, the Deerings, who were wonderful people, and I don't know how I came to be. Do you know how I came to be friends? Were you friends with Michael? Yeah. So there was a young man Kristen's age, and then there was a young man my age, and then a little sister. And we just glommed onto them. And Darren was my best friend for a while, and him and his sister, his little sister, who reminds me a lot of you, would come by my house to pick me up to walk to school every day. And so she'd come in, and I was running late, and so she would entertain my parents with her amazing self.
Before he goes further, Kevin came home one day after playing at the park with Darren, and I said, he looked stricken, both of them did. I said, what's going on? So what happened? You get in a fight or something? He goes, oh, nothing. I said, what? He said, a guy called Darren the N-word.
He's a girl, actually.
Huh?
A girl.
A girl? Oh, I didn't know that. And I said, what did you do?
We gave her a wedgie. Felt appropriate.
So what, as a parent, what would you do, right? Is that a civil disobedience thing? I don't know. We didn't know what to do.
Yes. So, but as you can tell, the culture that he and my mom created in our house was different in ways that were invisible to me, but curious and tolerant and respectful and culturally interested. He didn't even get to this, but we sponsored Eritrean refugees during the war in 1980, and so we inherited this huge Eritrean family that brought us to their houses and their weddings, and and we ate lots of Eritrean food. And then Kristen had a high school classmate who was Ethiopian and needed a place to live. And so she came to live with us for a year, and so we got Ethiopian family. One that I kind of...
Who, by the way,
Oh, yeah.
Marta Berihani is now Development Director for Africa for World Bank. So, asset, right? Go ahead.
Yep. The church we were a part of at the time, and I was really young when this happened. There was a refugee, and I don't even know what country he's from, a guy named Rene Hurtado, and he was fleeing from the police. I don't know,
El Salvador.
El Salvador. And I don't think I ever met him, but we had these secret meetings about trying to find a way to like hide him, protect him from being deported and sent back to the killing zones in El Salvador at the time. It felt really conspiratorial, and I don't know how that ever turned out, but I felt like I was involved in something really extraordinary. I also had this, and I wish I'd written it down. So at some point in a young age, maybe around 8, I had this really bizarre philosophical moment. I remember, so I was very emotional as a kid, and just explosive, and my family will tell you. And I just felt like, how can life be this full? How can, even in my little body, this, like, I'm just bursting with sensations and experiences and memories and moments. And something happened, and I realized that as I watched everybody walk by, that everybody else had that too. The full humanity of everybody. And it was transforming, because they weren't just people. They all had everything that I had. Different, but they had the fullness of that. And that full humanity. Fast forward, he goes on all these trips. He goes to Nicaragua, Mexico, Africa, Haiti, Palestine, has all these stories of justice, injustice, all those things humanized people all over the world. Particularly Nicaragua was very compelling to him, and then to me, because I'm mini him. And so the movement of the Sandinistas, who were socialists, but were doing all the right things, and then we sent our army to make sure they stopped doing the right things. So the social gospel, a radical Jesus, all that stuff felt really real to me. I had a second grade teacher, this is really telling during Black History Month. I had a second grade teacher who I'm sure is a lovely human being. She wasn't cruel, but we were learning about the presidents. I'm sure it was in February. And she showed us a picture of Mount Vernon. And this is George Washington's home, and he was our first president. And I observed, again, I'm not remarkable, but I looked at this picture and I saw brown bodies in the fields. And I said, who were those? They worked for George Washington. So did George Washington own slaves? No, this is second grade. And I watched her agonize for a moment, trying to figure out how to get out of this, because she's supposed to be teaching us about our amazing, infallible founding fathers. And she, I don't know, maybe I'm making it up in my head, but I remember her kind of making a decision and looking at me and saying, yes, but they liked working for him. And I knew I was being lied to, and I didn't like it. And then the next year I had a black teacher. And she was, excuse me, she was lovely, and she engaged conversations about race and who we are and the history of black people in this country. And I loved her. And that those two back to back, I think, yeah. So fast forward, music and culture, and in church, the church we went to had relationships with other churches, one on a native reservation in North Dakota, one with a Black Lutheran congregation in Chicago, Bethel New Life. We went to visit those places. We went to Mexico together and looked at, it was incredible. I was a teenager, my family went on one trip, and then the next year we went back again just as our youth group, all over Mexico, meeting people, doing service, learning, discovering. We went to Chicago to that Black Lutheran congregation and got their hospitality. We went to Turtle Mountain, went to a bunch of native reservations. I had an indigenous pastor who changed my view of those things by bringing her full self and her family into that. We went to Navajo Nation, and we worshiped in black churches. We went to, I think it was Zion in North Minneapolis. Blown away by gospel music. We went to an AME church in Atlanta. Again, these were all just moments, but you add them all up. Youth gatherings were hugely important to me, very formative, and there were enough people of color in my congregation that we could go to MILE, Multicultural Youth Leadership Event, before the gatherings, and it was all Lutherans of color, and I was like the exception. The white folks were like the also ran, right? And it was all about everybody else, and it was an amazing way to frame. And then obviously, the choice of who I want to have spent my life with is probably a kind of final culmination of that. So all that to say, it ended up being remarkable, and it shouldn't have to do that. But to think back to how you grew up, and to now the family I have in 2 generations, how much has changed, that's hopeful.
And that goes to your sermon.
Yes, oh my gosh.
And you had no idea you were going to do that, but it was perfect. Thank you.
Amen. I'm trying to do my best Mary Mergenthal timekeeping impersonation here, right, Mary? You know, whenever I see Mary get up and do that great walk, right, it's time, but we want to respect your time, but also make some time for responses. So
Yeah.
2 things. One is, if you haven't signed in, Mary asked that you please sign in just so we can keep track of who's attending Adult Ed. So if you need to leave, just sign in, let us know you were here. Also, if you would like to stay, I think we'd like to open it up for some responses. And what I love about what we've been gifted with here is an intergenerational entry point into the experience of this film. So as you know, there'll be more sessions with the film. We'll have a showing and then a part 2, and maybe Kevin, you could say more about that as well. But I'm going to just move around with the mic, so if there are responses or questions for Hal or Kevin, now's the time. Mary.
Did Toya want to say something?
No, but I think Toya, part 2, right? Maybe, right? Yeah, there we go. Did anyone else want to ask any questions or?
And it doesn't have to be about us. How were you formed? What have been the things that shaped you?
Yeah, what were the things that shaped you? How were you formed? Yeah, David.
I grew up in on the Iron Range, northeastern Minnesota. Pretty white up there. As a kid, I remember one instance where I saw a black man, and the kid on the bus next to me said, "Oh yeah, he's the only black man that lives in this area." And his name was Ed White. And the kid told me he likes it the way it is. He drives out any other blacks that come around. So that's the one instance I remember of some sort of racial interaction as a kid. And my next question goes to both Daniel and you. And I think we heard a call this morning to have some kind of more direct interaction with our black brothers and sisters in faith. And I guess the question is, how do we do that? And what does that look like?
Go ahead, Kevin.
Well, I can only speak from our experience. At our previous churches, Kevin said, we had a very intentional yoking with other congregations. They were not in the geographic area, which I think in some ways was not good. But I've also documented the yoking of congregations, for instance, in Fresno, that yoked a suburban congregation to an Hispanic congregation to a Hmong congregation, and they didn't pretend to need to actually worship together necessarily, but they were bound together and had lots of interchange. And so I think there are opportunities like that, then, so that you see that the condition or the challenges that other people have really can be your challenges as well. That it's us rather than the other. And I think that's transformative. I've got to tell one story that I forgot because I found it yesterday. We were in Liberia just as the war in Liberia was heating up. And I won't tell you all that story, but the church that we worshiped in was St. Peter's in Monrovia. And again, the bishop led this drum and choir down the aisle. And just a few months later, the war got really heated. That church was the site of a massacre. 600 people were gunned down. The church was destroyed in the interior. And as they were removing the bodies, the members of the church gathered up the spent cartridges, and they sent me this. It's a cartridge cut into a cross. I don't know if you can see it from where you are. So this cartridge probably killed somebody. They claimed the resurrection. I mean, that's the witness. So I forgot that. That's among others.
Kevin, do you have a response to David? Any
No, the premise where we talked originally is that relationship was one of the key ways to change this, because people are humans, they're not them anymore. And so partnership, relationship, all of that. Yep.
Yeah.
But you can't, I don't think you can do it in a vacuum. I don't think you can just say, we're going to be less,
Yes.
Yeah.
And I would say, David, I hope that our mission appeal conversations, if we find the right consultant to help us talk about that and the challenge, and my personal relationship with that issue is that find organizations that are working on structural issues that are important to those communities. And when you show up as leaders and as members, then there are more opportunities for relationship, for solidarity. Then you go to cooperative worship services, you start going to events at the Capitol, you start getting into one another's lives.
Yep.
So I think we're called to risk something for the sake of that solidarity. So I think it also takes leadership. Pastor Jill and I are meeting with local clergy here. We're starting that process in different ways. So with your support, we'll continue to ask those questions. So thanks for that. That was a great question. Other questions or comments?
I have one more
Yes,
story
go ahead.
I've got to tell. At Christmas, we gathered, and under difficult circumstances, you can imagine, with COVID and my wife immune compromised, but we had Christmas anyway. And one of the gifts I gave to Sapphira was my teddy bear when I was growing up, and I wrote a story about what Teddy meant to me. And when Sapphira opened the box, she broke into tears, crawled into my lap and sobbed. We all sobbed. For what you can imagine, for the last 2 years, for Pam's diagnosis. So, she didn't tell me why she cried, but she promised me she'd take care of him, and she has done a great job. And then when she came back, she realized I didn't have my teddy to take care of me, so she gave me a teddy.
Amen. Any other questions or comments for somebody? Oh, yep.
I guess as one of the youngest people here, I think just about this upbringing, I know my sister has done a lot to help educate our family on our internal biases, and I will admit that initially I was a little resistant to it, because I think just with my struggles in my life, I don't really like the concept of change too much, but I think learning to accept that was something that was really powerful. And also just watching this curriculum that I'm in change, and especially when every school I've been to in my life has been a majority white school, and especially Great River. So I think, but just everything that I've been learning in my classes, and it's a very big kind of it's a very big learning experience for me, because it's a lot of even in the history of the Americas class, just going in depth in what people had to go through, especially when we were wrapping up our Reconstruction unit. Even just looking at political cartoons from the time, we're just, so much has changed in what's considered acceptable. And I think my initial reaction was well, why didn't we think of that sooner? So, but yeah, it's watching all this change, especially in curriculum. I remember hearing from my history teacher that SPPS is going to hopefully mandate ethnic studies as a graduation requirement. So just learning how that's going to affect the next generation of students that come through that, because I think the more informed that the youth are, the more change we're able to make.
Amen. Thank you, Nick.
That's good.
Would you like to comment on that comment or no?
Doesn't need comment. That's
Speaks for
brilliant.
itself. Yeah, amen. Yeah,
Said
thank
it.
you for that. Powerful. Other questions or comments for Hal and Kevin?
The one thing I would say, I was forced into this, I didn't think about this in advance, was to journal your, or to make a map of your experience. It's very interesting, and I hadn't thought of ever doing it, but it exposes the narrative that you've been living with that maybe never been tested, but you get a chance to think about that. You know, is that true?
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that to us and opening with the mapping. That was a great image. Well, we're at time. I think I'll leave it to Kevin to give us a preview of the next session.
Yeah, so this we focused on formation, what formed the narrative that we have for ourselves. And then next week will be Michael Kleber Diggs again. And then the week after, the Saturday, we will show the film here. Although it's the same film that you can watch it at home if you want. The audio is not great. It's an old film and it's not a great transfer of the film, so it is what it is.
We just ordered a DVD.
Hey!
Yeah, so we'll have it on Tuesday, so we'll have a better
Good.
quality.
Excellent, all right. But it's powerful and it feels like it was made yesterday. And then on Sunday, we will look at formation, or transformation. How do we go from where we came from to a different place? Some of that, it is not a strategy. I don't have a thing for us to follow. I just have some questions for us to chew on, I think, mostly. And Toya will figure out what she's doing, what she's bringing to the table.
I'm hoping, in all honesty.
Here, Toya.
I'm hoping, in all honesty, that there is some engagement with the youth, because I think a huge part of this film, if you have not watched it, involves how the youth, specifically the African American youth, not really even the white youth, in all honesty, which I was a little disappointed by, but the African American youth are toiling over what it means to be Christian and how, as a congregation or as a faith, you know, and as a Christian, people of God, how we allow this type of, why this is so hard, right? If we're Christians and we're called to love our neighbors, why are we struggling with just the concept of talking to each other? Because at the end of the day, the struggle is about conversation. It's not about taking people to the grocery store. We just want to talk. And they struggled so hard with that idea that it never happened. And the kids are trying to wrap their minds around why. So I think given, you know, the fact that this was really compelling for the kids, I want to kind of get a sense of what our youth think and what our youth want for our congregation or just in general. How do we have those conversations? Because in all honesty, when we start to see change in this world, it's going to start with them and the generation after. I don't know that we can do a whole lot because there's so much racism that's ingrained in the people who are alive now and older that we really need the youth to step up at some point and really start shooting for making differences, because this is what their lives are going to be like, and this is the world that they live in. And they see things way differently than we do because none of these kids were alive back during the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. So the kind of world they want is the world that they're going to have to shoot for. If it involves having those conversations, you know, taking down systemic racism, then this is the stuff that we need to talk about. So I'm hoping that the kids have an opportunity, or the youth have an opportunity to watch it so that we can talk about it. Because for me, the thing that's important within our congregation is that I want my kids to feel like they belong and that they're welcomed and that they are not the only black kids in the youth group. Because growing up in Minnesota, I know what it's like to be the only black person in an all-white class. That's been the majority of my life. And it was different for me in terms of how I felt about that, but now that we have had all these very monumental things that have happened that my kids have been witness to, I need things to change. You know what I mean? Because they are going through the process of understanding their own identity, and I don't want them to feel like they have to choose. You are who you are, but know both sides of the story and figure out how we can live together and feel welcome in that process. So, and especially in a house of faith, this is the most important place for them. So that's kind of what I'm hoping for.
Good. Glad you talked, Toya.
Well, I think we'll end on that note with a prayer.
Good place.
God be with you. Lord God, you've called us, your servants, to ventures of which we cannot see the ending, by paths as yet untrodden, through perils unknown. Give us faith to go out with good courage, not knowing where we go, but only that your hand is leading us and your love supporting us. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, let all say. We have acknowledgement of applause for Hal and Kevin and Toya. Fantastic. Thank you all for coming. Please sign in again, and we'll see you next week for Michael Claver-Diggs, his second session.
It's an interesting time.